Let's get started. Story number 1.
The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as Anna pulled the covers tighter around her. She had always been a light sleeper, but lately the nightmares had grown more vivid, more unsettling. They had started innocently enough, images of old houses, forgotten places, things she couldn't quite place. But over time, they had shifted into something darker. Last night she had dreamt of a shadowy figure watching her from the foot of her bed. It had been so real. The chill in the room had lingered after she woke. Her alarm clock blinked 2:30 a.m. in the dim light, and Anna shifted restlessly, her mind racing. She tried to push the images from her mind and turn over to sleep, but there was something in the air tonight, something heavy and oppressive. Her eyes darted to the dark corners of her room, searching for any sign of movement. The shadows seemed to cling to the walls, watching her, waiting. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Her parents had left earlier for the weekend, leaving her alone in the old house at the edge of town. She had always liked the isolation, the stillness that allowed her to think, to feel like she could finally breathe. But tonight, it felt different. The silence pressed in on her, and the small creaks and groans of the house only heightened her unease. A sharp thud from downstairs jolted her upright in bed. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she froze, listening. The house was old, but that sound hadn't come from the usual creaks of settling floors. It was heavy, deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly swung her legs over the side of the bed. The cold wood of the floor made her shiver, but she ignored it, moving to the door. Her mind raced through possibilities, but none of them felt right. She wanted to believe it was the house settling, but something told her that wasn't it. With slow, deliberate steps, she crept toward the stairs. The hallway stretched out before her, dark and empty. She reached for the railing, her fingers brushing the smooth wood as she descended, each step echoing in the silence. The shadows seemed to follow her, stretching out longer with each passing second. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she stopped. The air felt colder here, as if something was waiting just out of sight. Her eyes scanned the room, flicking over the familiar furniture and the open doorway that led to the living room, but everything was still. Another thud. This time it came from inside the living room. Anna's heart raced, and she moved toward the doorway. She told herself it was just her imagination, but her instincts told her otherwise. She stood at the threshold, staring into the darkness of the room. The light from the hallway barely reached inside, and she couldn't see anything clearly. The thud came again, closer this time, as if whatever was making the noise was moving toward her. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She couldn't stand it anymore. She turned to leave, but then saw it. A shadow, something tall and slender, standing at the far corner of the room. Anna froze. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there, as if it was waiting for her to make the next move. Her pulse raced, her body frozen in fear. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure slowly shifted, its form stretching unnaturally, and Anna stumbled backward, her breath shallow and rapid. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. Without thinking, she turned and ran back up the stairs, the heavy sound of footsteps following her. She slammed the door to her bedroom behind her, locking it and backing away from it, her heart pounding in her chest. The room felt even colder now, and the shadows seemed to have grown deeper, as though the darkness had taken on a life of its own. She tried to calm herself, telling herself that it was just a bad dream, that she had imagined everything. But the shadows weren't going away. They clung to the walls, stretched across the floor, and wrapped around her like something sentient. The door to her bedroom rattled, a low, guttural sound coming from the other side. Anna's eyes widened in terror. There was no one out there, she knew that. No one who could have made that noise. She backed away, her body trembling, and grabbed the phone from her nightstand. Her fingers fumbled as she tried to dial her parents' number, but the screen kept glitching, flickering in and out of focus. Suddenly, the phone went dead. A cold laugh echoed from the hallway, sending a chill straight through her. The sound was wrong, distorted, as if it didn't belong in the world. Her mind raced. She needed to get out of the house. But where could she go? There was nowhere safe. The shadows had already invaded every corner of her room. There was no escaping them. A knock sounded from the door, a sharp, deliberate rap that made her jump. Anna, a voice called softly from the other side. It was her mother's voice, or at least it sounded like it. Anna, let me in. But something in the voice sounded off, wrong. It was too flat, too cold. Anna's pulse raced, her breath quickening. Her mother hadn't been here since that morning. She had left for the weekend. The voice came again, insistent. Anna, please, open the door. She stood motionless for a moment, torn between the overwhelming desire to flee and the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, her mother had come back early. She took a tentative step toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. But before she could touch it, the knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a loud scraping sound, as if something was dragging itself across the floor. Anna backed away from the door, her eyes wide with fear. Her mind screamed for her to leave, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The shadows in the room seemed to draw closer, crawling along the walls, the floor, and finally up toward her. She could feel their cold touch now, like icy fingers brushing against her skin. Suddenly, the door flew open with a loud crash, the dark figure from the living room now standing in the doorway, towering over her. Its shape was distorted, its body flickering between human and something else, something unnatural. Anna tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, unable to move, unable to look away. The figure loomed closer, its face hidden in shadow, but she could feel its eyes on her. There was nothing human about it. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing down on her as the figure reached out, its cold hands brushing her skin. She couldn't breathe. The air had thickened, suffocating her. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, disappearing into the shadows that seemed to consume the room. Anna lay on the floor, gasping for air, her body trembling uncontrollably. The shadows were gone, but the room still felt heavy, suffused with an eerie silence. She didn't know how long she lay there, too terrified to move, too afraid to sleep. The clock on her nightstand blinked 3:45 a.m. She wanted to believe it was over, that it had all been a nightmare. But deep down, she knew that it wasn't. It was real. The knocking started again, but this time it came from the inside of her room. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
I've never been a heavy sleeper, but after moving into the old apartment in the city, I quickly began to feel exhausted. The building wasn't new, far from it. The floors creaked, the walls were thin, and the windows didn't close properly. Still, the rent was cheap, and the place had character. After working long hours at my new job, I didn't mind the imperfections. It started quietly enough. The first night, I lay in bed, watching the shadows from the streetlights play on the ceiling. I was exhausted and eager to fall asleep, so I didn't think much of the distant noises coming from the hallway outside my apartment. The faint sound of footsteps, the faint hum of a conversation, and the occasional door creaking shut. But then, as the days passed, the sounds became harder to ignore. It was as if someone or something was always there. The subtle scraping noises under the floorboards, the soft tapping at my door, which I had convinced myself was the wind. I chalked it up to the building's age, settling foundations, maybe even the pipes. The apartment was a bit run down, but I figured that was just the charm of living in a vintage building. A few weeks into living there, I started having dreams. They weren't particularly strange at first, just the usual stress dreams. Late for work, forgetting something important, that sort of thing. But then the dreams started to change. They became darker, more vivid. I would find myself in my apartment, lying in bed, feeling wide awake but unable to move. It was as if I was paralyzed, and there was someone standing in the room with me. I could never see them clearly, but I could feel their presence, heavy, looming, just beyond my sight. I tried to scream, to call out, but nothing came out. It felt as though my voice had been stolen, and all I could do was lie there, frozen in fear. The person would get closer and closer until I could feel their breath on my neck, and then I would wake up, gasping for air, my heart racing. The dreams continued for days, sometimes several times a week. At first, I tried to tell myself they were just nightmares, but after a while I wasn't so sure. They felt too real. The sensation of being watched, the feeling of someone beside me, it was all too tangible, too close. One night, I woke up to the sound of something scraping across the floor. It wasn't the usual noises I'd gotten used to. It was much more distinct. This time, it was coming from inside the room, right by my bed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I froze, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of it. It happened again. Scrape, 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 like fingernails running along the wood. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt that suffocating weight in the air again, as if someone was standing next to me, their presence overwhelming. I finally gathered the courage to sit up, flicking on the bedside lamp. The room was empty. Nothing was there. No figure, no strange person, just the quiet hum of the city outside. But the scrape, it had felt so real. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. I figured it was another weird dream, maybe a product of my overactive imagination. But the noises continued. Every night, I would wake up to that scraping sound, followed by a faint whisper, like someone trying to get my attention. It wasn't a language I recognized, just a low, guttural hum. I told myself that I was just tired, that the stress of the new job was getting to me. But the longer I stayed in the apartment, the worse it got. The dreams intensified. Sometimes I would wake up mid-dream, only to find myself unable to move, trapped in the bed, unable to make a sound. And each time, the feeling of someone being there just out of sight would send me into a panic. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I lay in bed, wide awake, straining to listen for the familiar sounds. The scraping, the whispering. My heart thudded in my chest, and I could feel my body tensing, waiting for it. I told myself I was being foolish, that there was no one in the room. But then, just as I started to drift off to sleep, I heard it. A soft voice, clear as day, right next to my ear. Wake up. I shot up in bed, gasping for air. My head was spinning, my pulse racing. There was no one there, no one standing by my side, no figure in the dark, but the voice had been so real. It wasn't my imagination. It felt as though someone had whispered directly into my ear. I couldn't stay there anymore. I had to leave. The next morning, I called my friend Rachel and told her everything. She was concerned, of course, but she didn't understand. "It sounds like stress, really," she said. "You're probably just tired. You should come stay with me for a few nights. It'll help you reset." I agreed to go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something behind. That whatever had been in that apartment wasn't done with me yet. It had felt like it was waiting for me to leave, like it wanted me to go. When I returned to the apartment a few days later, I noticed something strange. The air was heavier, more oppressive. The hallway light was flickering, and the apartment felt colder than I remembered. As soon as I stepped inside, the familiar unease returned, the scratching noises, the whispers, and then the voice, clearer this time. "Come closer." I froze in place. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Something was there, in the dark, waiting. I could feel it, its presence looming just behind me. My mind raced. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. I grabbed my bag and rushed to the door, but before I could reach the handle, I heard the voice again. This time louder, more demanding. "Don't go." I didn't look back as I ran out of the apartment, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool air hitting my face. I called Rachel, my voice shaky, barely able to get the words out. "I can't stay there. Something's wrong with that place. Something's there with me." She was quiet for a moment before responding. "Come to my place. We'll figure this out." I stayed with her for the next few weeks, trying to regain some sense of normalcy, but the dreams didn't stop. The feeling of being watched didn't stop, and every night the voice still whispered to me. I never went back to that apartment. It was a strange kind of relief to leave, but also a lingering sense of dread that followed me wherever I went. People told me it was just a bad experience, a product of my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew what I had felt, what I had heard. And sometimes when the night is still, I swear I can hear the voice calling my name from somewhere in the darkness. Come back. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was an ordinary Wednesday evening when I settled into bed, exhausted after a long day of work. The kind of day where everything felt off. Meetings dragged on longer than expected, my coffee spilled all over my shirt, and I barely managed to make dinner before the sun went down. It was the kind of day where the bed seems like the only place worth being, a haven to retreat into. I turned the lights off and pulled the blankets over me, sinking into the familiar comfort of my pillow. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the old house were the only sounds. As my eyes fluttered shut, I thought about how lucky I was to be home in my small, quiet apartment, away from the noise of the city. But I didn't sleep. Not right away. My mind raced through the events of the day, the small annoyances and tasks left undone. I tried to quiet my thoughts, focusing on the sound of my breath as I shifted in bed, trying to find a comfortable position. After what felt like an hour, I finally succumbed to the pull of sleep. But the moment I drifted off, something changed. It wasn't a loud, sudden noise or a startling sensation, just a quiet shift, almost imperceptible at first. The air around me grew heavy, thick, as if the room itself had become something different. I opened my eyes, expecting to find the darkness of my bedroom just as I had left it. But instead, there was something just beyond the edges of my vision. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, slinking toward the corners of the room. My breath hitched in my throat as I squinted into the darkness. It was so still, too still. Even the house seemed to have gone silent, as if it were holding its breath. I turned my head toward the clock on the nightstand. 2:42 a.m. The quiet hum of my apartment returned, filling the empty space around me, but there was still something off. Then I heard it. A sound, barely audible at first, but unmistakable once I focused on it. It was soft, like the sound of something brushing against the floor. A drag, then a tap, another drag. The sound came from the far corner of the room, near the closet. I could feel my pulse quicken as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the house settling, a pipe, a draft. But the sound continued. Drag, tap, drag. My body tensed. I didn't want to look, but I had to. My heart thudded in my chest as I slowly turned my head, my eyes scanning the darkness. The room was still and silent, but the dragging sound persisted, each step a little closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperate to convince myself it was just a figment of my imagination. But when I opened them again, the sound was unmistakably closer. My breath caught in my throat as I turned slowly to face the direction of the noise. There, at the foot of my bed, just beyond the edge of the bed frame, was a shadow. It was too dark to make out any clear shape, but it was there, standing just out of reach. My skin crawled as I stared at the shadow, unable to look away. There was no logical explanation. No source of light to cast it, no object or person to form the shape. Just a presence, a feeling. And then the sound stopped. My heart skipped a beat, but I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I felt frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The longer I stared at that shadow, the more it seemed to grow, the edges blurring and shifting. It wasn't just a shape anymore, it was something other. The air felt impossibly thick. My chest tightened. I wanted to scream, to jump up and run, but the fear had gripped me so tightly that I couldn't summon the strength to move. My mind screamed for me to wake up, but I knew deep down that I wasn't asleep. This was real. Then, a voice. Soft. Almost a whisper. It was coming from the shadow, but I couldn't understand the words. It wasn't a language I recognized. The voice, if you could call it that, was distorted, like it was being filtered through a wall of static. It was incomprehensible, yet somehow deeply unsettling. Please, I whispered to myself, please, just be a dream. I shut my eyes, willing myself to wake up, but when I opened them again, the shadow was closer, right at the edge of my bed. I didn't want to look, but my body betrayed me, forcing my eyes to flicker over the shape again. It was towering over me now. The shadows around it seemed to pulse, like the room itself was trying to consume it. And as the figure leaned forward, I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating the air. I tried to scream, but my throat was tight, as though my voice was trapped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then it moved. It wasn't a smooth motion, but a jagged one, like something was pulling and stretching it from the inside out. I felt a cold, unnatural breeze whip through the room as the figure twisted, contorted, and finally stepped into the space right next to my bed. It was tall, impossibly tall, and for the briefest moment, I thought I could make out the silhouette of a face, but it wasn't human. Its eyes were dark pits, empty and unfeeling. Its body was long and thin, stretched unnaturally, its limbs twisted in ways they shouldn't be. My mind screamed again, but my body stayed paralyzed, frozen under the weight of its gaze. The shadow seemed to loom over me, its cold presence filling every inch of the room. Then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the figure began to move again. this time slowly, deliberately, as if toying with me. It stepped back into the darkness, its presence still hanging heavy in the air. I closed my eyes tightly, pressing my face into the pillow, praying that it would all go away. When I finally dared open them again, the shadow was gone. The room was still, silent. But the feeling, the oppressive weight, the crawling sensation at the back of my mind lingered. The clock read 3:04 a.m. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside the window made my heart race. I could still feel it, that presence in the edges of my vision, lurking just beyond the light. When the sun finally rose, I thought it was over, that maybe it had been a nightmare, a trick of exhaustion. But as I got up and moved through the apartment, my eyes flickered to the closet, the same corner where the shadow had stood, and I saw it. A dark mark on the floor, a drag, a tap, and it was moving closer. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I had always been a deep sleeper. My family used to joke that I could sleep through anything, a car alarm, a storm, even the blaring sound of an air horn. But it wasn't always that way. It took me a while to get used to sleeping in my new apartment, an old building in the city that had a kind of charm despite its creaky floors and narrow hallways. I had been living in it for a few weeks before I started noticing the strange things that happened during the night. At first, it was nothing more than a feeling, a slight unease, like I wasn't truly alone when I closed my eyes. The apartment was on the second floor, with only a thin layer of walls separating me from the neighbors, but I didn't mind the usual sounds: a car passing by, footsteps from the people above me, the occasional shout or laugh from the street below. They didn't bother me. In fact, they were a comfort in a new place, something familiar. But then, a few nights in, I began hearing something different. It started with what sounded like whispers. They were faint at first, so faint that I wondered if they were just coming from the street or from someone else's apartment. But the more I listened, the more certain I became that the voices were coming from within my own room. It wasn't clear like people talking. It was just a soft murmur, almost like someone was speaking just below hearing range. At first, I tried to dismiss it, convinced it was the wind or a neighbor talking loudly through the thin walls. But then the whispers grew more persistent. I'd wake up at night, lying in the dark, trying to make sense of it. The sound was no longer a murmur. It was a voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. I never understood the words, but it sounded like someone was standing at the foot of my bed, speaking in low tones, just out of reach. I would lay there, terrified to move, my heart pounding in my chest, my body frozen, unable to speak or even reach for the light. After a few minutes, the whispers would fade and I'd fall into an uneasy sleep again, only to wake up at the same time the next night, the same feeling of dread creeping into my mind. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was probably just sleep deprived from the new routine, the stress of settling into a new apartment and job. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One night, it was worse than usual. I had woken up to the familiar feeling of being watched. My eyes darted around the room, searching the dark corners for any sign of movement. I was lying on my back, staring at the ceiling, trying to steady my breathing. And then I heard it, a noise from the corner of the room. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was more like a shuffle, as if something or someone was moving around in the dark. I tried to sit up, but my body wouldn't respond. My mind screamed at me to get up, to turn on the light, but I couldn't. It was as though something was holding me down, keeping me from moving. The shuffle came closer. I could feel it, feel the air shift in the room. It was so close now. I couldn't breathe. I closed my eyes, willing the sensation to go away, but it only grew stronger. The shuffling stopped, and then came the softest sound, a breath. It wasn't mine. It was slow, deliberate, and filled with a kind of tension I couldn't understand. A soft breath in the dark, like someone was standing right next to me, breathing in my ear. My heart was racing, my body trembling, and still I couldn't move. I could feel the weight of whatever was there, just out of sight. I tried again to scream, but nothing came out. The room felt suffocating, like the air itself was thick with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the feeling disappeared. The air cleared, the presence lifted, and I was left lying there, heart still pounding, gasping for air. I didn't sleep well the rest of that night. When the morning came, I tried to convince myself that it was just a bad dream, that I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I knew what I had felt. I spent the next few days in a haze. The nightmares continued. The feeling of being watched didn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was waiting for me, waiting to take me, to pull me deeper into the darkness. Sometimes I would wake up, unable to move, unable to breathe, just frozen in place. And when I would finally snap out of it, I'd find myself lying there in the dark, my body drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried everything to make it stop. I turned on lights when I went to sleep, hoping the illumination would keep the presence at bay. I even started sleeping with my head under the covers, thinking that maybe if I couldn't see anything, it wouldn't see me. But the whispers and the shuffling didn't stop. It was as though whatever it was growing stronger, more persistent, and more demanding. One night, I reached a breaking point. I woke up to the same feeling of being watched, but this time it was different. The whispers weren't just whispers anymore. They were clearer. They were words now. They spoke to me in a language I didn't understand. I tried to turn my head to look, but my body was frozen, locked in place. The voice grew louder, closer. It wasn't coming from the corner anymore. It was coming from right next to me, right by my ear. I could feel the breath on my skin. I could hear the voice, and I knew, somewhere deep down, that whatever it wasn't human. "Wake up," the voice whispered. "Come closer." I fought against the paralysis, desperate to move, to escape. But I couldn't. It was as if something was holding me down, keeping me there. The room grew colder, and I could feel the presence, that suffocating weight, pressing in on me from all sides. Suddenly, the pressure lifted. I could move again. I scrambled out of bed, turning on the light, panting and gasping. The room was empty. There was nothing there. But I knew what had happened. I knew it hadn't been a dream. It had been real. I didn't stay in the apartment much longer after that. I packed my things and moved in with a friend for a few weeks, trying to make sense of what had happened. But I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Something had marked me. Even when I tried to sleep at my friend's house, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, the whispers that seemed to call my name from the shadows. Eventually, I moved again, this time to a new city, a new apartment. I hoped that distance would erase the memory, but even now, when I lay down to sleep at night, sometimes I hear it, the whispering, the breath in my ear, the soft shuffle of footsteps, and sometimes I still feel the weight of something just behind me, waiting. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
I've always been a deep sleeper, the kind of person who can fall asleep anywhere. My roommates would joke that I could sleep through a tornado if I wanted to. But this story is different. This is a story of a night I couldn't forget, one that has haunted me for months, and one I still can't quite explain. It all started on a Thursday evening. I had just come back from a long day at work, and exhaustion was weighing on me. I lived in a small apartment tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, with thin walls that allowed every sound from the outside to creep in. The familiarity of the place always made me feel at ease. I had lived there for nearly 3 years, and nothing had ever felt out of place. That night, I decided to get an early start on my sleep. I had no plans for the evening and was looking forward to the stillness of my room. After a quick shower, I turned off all the lights, slid under the covers, and closed my eyes, letting the softness of my bed pull me in. At first, everything was peaceful. The only noise was the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional rustle of the leaves outside my window. But as I drifted further into sleep, the stillness of the room began to feel wrong. It wasn't that the room was too quiet, it was the silence that felt too thick, as if something was hiding just beneath the surface. The first thing I noticed was a small sound, a faint scrape like something was dragging across the floor. My eyes snapped open, and I lay still for a moment, trying to make sense of it. It was so faint, I almost thought I imagined it. But then it came again, followed by another, a dragging noise, closer this time. I shifted in bed, pushing myself up on one elbow, my heart beating a little faster. It was hard to place where the sound was coming from. My first instinct was to check the window, but there were no other apartments on that side of the building. The windows were too high up for anyone to be near them. I glanced around my room. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The dim light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows, but nothing moved. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was probably the old pipes in the walls or something settling in the building. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. But then a louder noise broke the silence. It was unmistakable this time. The scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor, directly beneath my bed. My body froze. My mind raced. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the neighbors upstairs. Maybe the floorboards were just creaking. But the sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. I slowly slid my legs out from under the covers, my feet touching the cold wooden floor. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but when I glanced at it, I saw that the screen was blank. No notifications, no lights, just darkness. The scraping sound came again, closer, moving beneath the bed, and my breath caught in my throat. I could feel my heartbeat thumping in my chest. Every muscle in my body was tense, and a cold sweat began to form on the back of my neck. I wanted to move, to get out of the room, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I tried to listen carefully, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breath and that awful scraping. Then, as if it had all been a figment of my imagination, it stopped. Silence. Pure silence. I felt a small sense of relief wash over me, but my mind was still on edge. What was that? Was it an animal? A person? I took a few slow breaths, trying to calm my nerves, when I heard something else, footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone were pacing just outside my bedroom door. I felt a chill run through me. Who would be here at this hour? My roommates were both out for the night, and I knew I was alone. I didn't move. I just listened. The footsteps didn't stop. They circled the outside of my door, pausing every so often as if the person was waiting for something, or someone. My mind raced. Should I call the police? Should I run out the back door? But what terrified me the most was the feeling, the sensation of being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone standing just on the other side of the door, waiting for me to make a sound, to react. The footsteps grew louder. They were right outside my room now, and I could hear the faint shuffle of shoes against the floor. My chest tightened as I struggled to breathe. Suddenly, the door handle jiggled. It wasn't a hard rattle, just a faint turn as if someone was testing the lock. It happened so quietly that if I hadn't been listening so intently, I might have missed it. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement. But there was nothing. The footsteps stopped, the door handle stopped. Everything went completely still. I couldn't take it anymore. My mind was unraveling, and the fear was consuming me. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and tried calling my roommate. It rang several times before going to voicemail. I tried again, nothing, and then it came. A soft knock. So quiet I almost missed it, but it was there. A slow, methodical knock on the door. 1, 3. I didn't answer. I couldn't. And then I heard the scraping again. It wasn't on the floor this time, but something had shifted. The scraping was coming from inside my room now, from under the bed. It moved slowly at first, then faster, as if whatever it was under there was getting closer. I was paralyzed. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. My hands were shaking, and I didn't know what to do. And then I saw it. A shadow. A shape moving in the dark under the bed. A figure that didn't belong. It was low to the ground, almost crawling, with long, spindly arms that stretched unnaturally long. I could see its outline, its limbs jerking as it dragged itself closer to me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shadow was almost to the edge of the bed, and I could feel it, right there, so close to me. And then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the edge of the bed, waiting for something, anything to move. But nothing did. When the sun finally rose, I was still there, frozen in place. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room, and the normal sounds of the morning didn't feel the same. They were muffled, distant, as if I were still caught in some sort of nightmare. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I couldn't bring myself to speak of it. But that night, when I went to bed again, I couldn't shake the feeling. I couldn't stop myself from looking under the bed before I closed my eyes, checking every corner of the room, knowing deep down that whatever it was had never really left. I tried to go on with my life. I still sleep in that apartment, still live in the same room, but every night when I close my eyes, I can feel the presence, the weight of it, waiting just beyond the darkness. I hear the scraping sometimes, soft at first, then growing louder, but I never move. I never dare. Because if I do, I know it will find me. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
The first time it happened, I thought it was a dream. At least I hoped it was. I'd always been a heavy sleeper, the kind of person who could sleep through anything. My friends would laugh, saying I was practically comatose by the time I hit the pillow. But that night, something was different. I had been working late, staring at a screen too long, the exhaustion from the day's demands weighing heavily on me. When I finally made it to bed, I remember being relieved that I'd have at least a few hours of sleep before having to get up for work again. I woke up with a start in the middle of the night, the covers tangled around me. It took me a moment to orient myself, but I didn't feel right. Something in the air was heavy, like the atmosphere itself had thickened. I sat up slowly, blinking into the dark room. The only light was from the street lamp outside my window, casting long, faint shadows on the walls. The silence was unnerving, almost suffocating. I thought I heard something, a sound, very faint but unmistakable. It was the softest of movements, like the scrape of fabric or the shuffle of bare feet on carpet. I glanced toward the door, my eyes straining to adjust to the low light. But there was nothing there. I tried to ignore the unease creeping over me, attributing it to the usual post-sleep fog. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. But then, as I lay back down, it came again. A slow, deliberate step, like someone was walking around my room. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up again, my pulse quickening. I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every corner. The shadows looked deeper now, as though something was moving just beyond them. But when I checked the door, it was still closed. The apartment was empty. I was alone, or so I thought. There was no logical reason for it, but I could feel the presence. I didn't want to look, didn't want to acknowledge what my brain was suggesting. But my body was frozen. I had never felt so exposed, like something was watching me. I forced myself to lie back down, pulling the covers tightly over my body as if they could protect me from whatever was lurking just outside my sight. I closed my eyes, focusing on my breathing, trying to calm myself down. Maybe I had just woken up in the middle of a sleep cycle. Maybe it was nothing. But then the sound came again, closer this time, the unmistakable drag of feet across the carpet. I shot up, my breath catching in my throat. I knew I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't crazy. Someone was in the room with me. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, my hands shaking. I quickly dialed the number of my best friend, desperate for someone to talk to, for someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. As it rang, I turned my head toward the door, straining to hear. Nothing. It was too quiet. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. My heart was pounding in my chest now. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to check. Slowly, I slid out of bed, my feet touching the cold hardwood floor. I paused, listening intently. No sounds, no footsteps, no shuffling. The apartment was still. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the mind, some kind of hallucination from too little sleep. But the feeling of being watched, that palpable sense of dread, wouldn't go away. My hand was still gripping the phone, my knuckles white with the force of it. I knew I had to check. I had to see if something was there. I crept to the door, slowly, cautiously. My breath hitched with every step, my heart beating louder than I thought possible. When I reached the door, I didn't open it right away. I pressed my ear against it, straining to hear anything on the other side. But there was nothing. Nothing at all. I stood there for a long time, frozen in place. It felt like the air was thick with something. Wrong. I could feel it pressing in on me, and I couldn't bring myself to open the door. The silence was so profound, it was almost as if the world had gone still, waiting. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it. A soft rustle, faint but distinct, as if something was moving just behind the door. I jerked away from it, my heart racing. But I didn't run. I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the floor. My body was paralyzed. And then the doorknob turned, slowly, gently, as if someone was testing it. I could feel my blood run cold. I had never been so terrified in my life. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just stood there, staring at the door, waiting. but the knob never turned all the way. It stopped halfway. A soft click followed by an unsettling silence. The terror in me started to swell. Was I hearing things? Was someone really on the other side of that door trying to get in? My mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Suddenly, a sharp noise broke the silence. A knock. Very light. Just 3 taps. I backed away from the door in one quick motion, my breath coming out in sharp gasps. My phone fell from my hand and clattered to the floor. I was shaking now, unable to control it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The apartment was silent once more. Completely silent. Too silent. I waited, frozen in the center of the room. My body was shaking with adrenaline, but I couldn't bring myself to move, to do anything. My mind was overwhelmed, full of questions I couldn't answer. What had just happened? Had it been real? Had I really heard something? I finally gathered enough courage to look at the door again. Still closed. The room was as still as ever, but my feet couldn't seem to move. The weight of the moment kept me trapped, glued to the spot. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun streamed through the blinds, and the air felt lighter, less oppressive. My phone had slipped under the bed, and when I picked it up, I noticed there were no missed calls, no messages, nothing to explain the terror that had plagued me the night before. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just some combination of stress and exhaustion, that I'd imagined everything. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something had happened in that room. Something I couldn't explain. The next few nights passed without incident, and I thought maybe I was just overthinking it, convincing myself I was safe again. But that wasn't the end of it. It happened again, a week later at the same time. The shuffling, the knocking, the cold dread that settled in my chest, paralyzing me in my bed. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't just a trick of my mind. It was real. And whatever it was, whatever had been there with me, had returned. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I've always been a light sleeper, so it's strange that I didn't notice the oddities in my new apartment right away. At first, everything seemed normal, old but livable. The floors creaked a bit, and the pipes made strange sounds when the water was running. That was to be expected in a place that had been built decades ago. I moved in with the usual excitement and settled in, unpacking boxes and rearranging the furniture until everything felt just right. The first couple of nights were peaceful. I slept through the night, waking up to the sounds of the city filtering through the walls and the morning sun creeping in through the window. But as the days went on, I began to feel unsettled. The feeling crept up on me slowly like a shadow that followed me everywhere I went. At first, it was subtle, a flicker in the corner of my vision, a sound that seemed out of place. I tried to ignore it. I was busy with work and life in general, and I convinced myself it was just stress from the move. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger as time went on. It was like someone or something was always there, just out of sight. The real trouble started one night, about 2 weeks after I moved in. I had been working late and came home feeling exhausted. I didn't even bother with dinner, just a quick shower and then straight to bed. I had been tossing and turning for about an hour when I started to hear something. It wasn't loud, just a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging against the floor. I lay still for a moment, trying to pinpoint the source, but there was nothing. No animals, no furniture shifting. Just the sound. At first, I thought it was the building settling, or maybe a rat in the walls. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder. It came from the hallway outside my bedroom, moving closer, dragging across the floorboards. My heart rate quickened as I lay frozen in bed, unable to move, unable to breathe. I listened, every nerve on edge, waiting for it to stop. The sound didn't stop. It got closer, and then it stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. There was nothing, no more scratching, no breathing, no footsteps, just silence. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was imagining things, but the fear wouldn't leave me. I finally gathered the courage to get up and check the hallway, but when I opened the door, there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the single light bulb at the end. Everything looked normal, but the scratching sound was still in my mind, echoing through the silence like a threat I couldn't escape. I closed the door behind me and went back to bed. my body trembling. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when I finally did drift off, I woke up several times, convinced I had heard something or someone moving around in my room. But every time I checked, the room was empty. The next morning, I told myself it was just stress. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, but the feeling of unease lingered, hanging over me like a heavy fog. And that night, it happened again. The scratching. The sound was louder this time, more deliberate. It wasn't just coming from the hallway, it was coming from inside my room, just behind the door. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My body was frozen, my heart racing as I lay in the dark, waiting for it to stop. It felt as though the room itself was closing in on me. I didn't dare open my eyes. I didn't want to see what was out there or what might be waiting in the dark. I just wanted it to stop. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move my limbs to get up, but my body wouldn't respond. Finally, the sound stopped. I opened my eyes slowly and the room was still empty. But I could feel something in the air, something heavy, something wrong. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I started to sleep with the lights on after that. I figured if I could see everything, it would make me feel safer. But the feeling of being watched never went away. Every night, as I drifted off to sleep, I could feel it, like a presence in the room, waiting, watching. It wasn't until a week later that things took a darker turn. I had been having trouble sleeping, waking up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. Every time I tried to fall back asleep, I felt a pressure on my chest, as if someone was sitting on me, pinning me to the bed. I could barely breathe, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move. It felt like a nightmare, but I was wide awake. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night to find myself unable to move again. But this time, it wasn't just the pressure on my chest. It was as if there was something else in the room with me, standing just out of reach. I could feel the weight of it, but I couldn't see it. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry and no sound came out. I wanted to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. The presence in the room seemed to grow stronger, and I could hear it now. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking around my bed. I could feel the air shift with each step, the coldness in the room deepening. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to react. Then I heard a voice, soft, faint, but unmistakable. It whispered my name, low and guttural, right in my ear. I snapped awake, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I was back in my bed, and the room was still, quiet. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, like an invisible weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The next day, I started looking for a new place to live. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew I had to get out. I told a few friends about the strange occurrences, but none of them believed me. They thought I was overreacting, that it was just stress, just my imagination running wild. But I knew what I had felt, what I had heard. The night before I was set to leave, I stayed up packing, trying to finish everything before I had to hand in the keys. As I packed the last of my things, I heard the scratching sound again. It started faint, like it always did, and then grew louder. But this time, it wasn't just coming from the hallway, it was coming from inside my closet. I walked slowly toward the door, my breath caught in my throat, and opened it. The room was empty, but the scratching didn't stop. It was coming from the closet now, sharp and rhythmic. It sounded like claws dragging across the wood, slow and deliberate, getting closer and closer to the door. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't move. I didn't want to open that closet, but I knew I had to. I grabbed the doorknob, and with a shaking hand, I pulled the door open. There was nothing in the closet. Nothing at all. I closed the door, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. Something was wrong with this place. Something was wrong with me. I never finished packing that night. I couldn't. I left the apartment the next morning, keys in hand, without looking back. I moved to a new place, far from the city, where I could start fresh. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I hear the scratching, the whispering, and I wonder if whatever it was, whatever followed me, is still out there, waiting, watching. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The night it happened, I had been tossing and turning for hours. Sleep didn't come easily for me, not since moving into that small, dimly lit apartment. It was old, Paint peeling from the walls, creaking floorboards, the faint smell of mildew clinging to the air. But it was cheap, and for someone on a tight budget, it was all I could afford. The strange noises started the first week I moved in. At first, it was nothing I could pinpoint, just faint creaks and groans I attributed to the building settling. Old places make sounds, I told myself. It's normal. But it wasn't long before the sounds became less random and more deliberate. At night, I'd hear footsteps above me, heavy and slow, even though the apartment directly upstairs was vacant. Sometimes there would be a soft tapping on the walls, always rhythmic, like someone was deliberately knocking but didn't want to be heard. I ignored it. I told myself I was imagining things, letting the isolation of living alone get to me. But on this particular night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, as though it were pressing down on me. The faint glow of the streetlight outside filtered through the thin curtains, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. It was sometime after midnight when I finally drifted off, exhausted and restless. I remember waking up suddenly, the kind of jolt that feels like you've been startled awake, but without any apparent reason. My heart was racing, and I sat up in bed, blinking into the darkness. The room was silent, eerily so. Not even the usual hum of the refrigerator or the distant noise of traffic outside. That's when I heard it, a faint shuffling sound like feet dragging across the floor. It wasn't coming from above this time. It was inside my apartment. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound was coming from the direction of the living room, just beyond my bedroom door. It was slow and deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard but unable to mask the subtle movements. My first thought was that someone had broken in. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but my hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. I checked the time, 2:47 a.m. I sat there in the dark, gripping my phone, debating whether to call the police. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it. But then the sound came again, closer this time. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't coming from the living room anymore. It was coming from the hallway, right outside my bedroom door. I stared at the door, my heart pounding in my ears. The doorknob was in clear view from where I sat, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. For a moment, everything was still. The shuffling stopped. The apartment was silent again, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes on me, like something just beyond the door was waiting. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. I just sat there, paralyzed, watching as the knob twisted ever so slightly, the faintest click echoing in the silence. It didn't open all the way. It stopped just short of unlocking, as though whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wanted me to know they were there. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the door, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, the doorknob turned back to its original position, and the room fell silent once more. I didn't dare move. My phone was still clutched in my hand, but I didn't call anyone. I was too scared to make a sound, afraid that any noise might draw whatever was out there into my room. Hours passed, and I stayed awake, my eyes glued to the door. The sun eventually rose, and the pale light of morning seeped into the room, chasing away the shadows. Only then did I muster the courage to get up and check the rest of the apartment. I opened the bedroom door slowly, my heart racing, every nerve in my body on edge. The hallway was empty. The living room was just as I had left it. Nothing was out of place. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there. I tried to convince myself it was a dream, some kind of sleep-induced hallucination. But as I was locking up the apartment later that day, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Faint, muddy footprints on the floor just outside my bedroom door. They weren't mine. They were too large, and the shape of them was wrong, as though whoever had made them was dragging their feet with each step. I scrubbed the floors until they were spotless, trying to erase the memory along with the footprints. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, every creak and groan of the old apartment setting my nerves on edge. Hours passed in silence, and just as I started to relax, thinking maybe it was over, I heard it again. The soft shuffle of feet, the slow, deliberate turn of the doorknob. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone, locked myself in the bathroom, and called the police. When they arrived, they found no one in the apartment, no signs of forced entry, nothing to explain what I had experienced. They assured me it was probably my imagination, that stress and lack of sleep could cause vivid hallucinations. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. I moved out a week later, breaking my lease and leaving most of my belongings behind. I didn't care about the money or the inconvenience. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. Even now, months later, I still have trouble sleeping. I keep a light on in my room and double check every lock before I go to bed. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll wake up suddenly, my heart racing, and I'll swear I hear it again. The faint shuffle of feet, the slow turn of a doorknob. And I wonder if whatever was in that apartment followed me. Story the end.
Story number 9.
And when I moved into my new apartment, it felt like a fresh start. It wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom place on the 3rd floor of an old building. The rent was cheap and the location was decent. The landlord had mentioned that the previous tenant left suddenly, but I didn't think much of it. People move all the time. For the first couple of nights, everything was fine. The place was quiet, the neighbors kept to themselves, and I was finally able to unpack and settle in. The only strange thing was the bedroom window. It faced a narrow alley, and across from it was another building with an identical layout. At night, if I left the curtains open, I could see into the windows across the alley. Most were dark, but occasionally I'd catch a glimpse of someone moving inside, just shadows against the curtains. One night, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, I felt a strange sensation. It was subtle, like a nagging thought at the back of my mind. I suddenly had the distinct feeling that I was being watched. I glanced toward the window, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move. The curtains across the alley fluttered, but no light was on. It was probably just the wind, I told myself. I closed my own curtains, rolled over, and tried to sleep. That was when the dreams started. At first, they weren't too bad, just flashes of dark shapes and muffled voices. I couldn't remember much when I woke up, but they left me feeling uneasy, like I'd forgotten something important. Over the next week, the dreams became more vivid. I'd find myself lying in bed in the dream, unable to move, while a shadowed figure stood at the foot of my bed, staring at me. It never spoke, never moved. It just stood there. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Every time I'd tell myself it was just a nightmare, nothing more. But the fear lingered. And then things started happening while I was awake. One night, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was coming from the window. I turned on the bedside lamp and sat up, my pulse quickening. The sound stopped as soon as the light came on. I waited, listening to the silence, before getting up to check the window. When I pulled the curtain aside, the alley below was empty. The windows across from mine were dark. I stood there for a moment, scanning the empty alley before going back to bed. The tapping returned the next night, but this time it was louder. It sounded like it was coming from inside the room. I sat up quickly, turning on the light, but again the sound stopped. My eyes darted around the room, but everything was in its place. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling, the pipes, or maybe a neighbor making noise. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. A few nights later, I woke up to the feeling of someone standing over me. My room was dark, but I could feel it, the presence. My heart pounded as I reached for the lamp, but when the light flooded the room, there was nothing there. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I sat there for hours, too afraid to turn the light off. By now, I was barely sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching me, waiting for me to drift off. The dreams grew worse. In them, I'd wake up to find my bedroom door slowly creaking open, or I'd see that shadowy figure again, standing just inches away from my bed. Sometimes I'd hear a voice whisper my name, soft and low, like it was right next to my ear. One night, I decided to stay up as long as I could. I left every light in the apartment on, made myself coffee, and sat on the couch with the TV playing quietly in the background. Around 2 a.m., I started to drift off, despite my best efforts. My eyelids grew heavy, and I could feel sleep pulling me under. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, like someone walking barefoot across the wooden floor. My breath caught in my throat as I listened. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped right behind me. I froze, too terrified to turn around. My body felt like it was made of lead, unable to move. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I felt a cold breath against my ear. And then a whisper, "You can't hide." I shot up from the couch, spinning around, but the room was empty. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The lights were still on, the TV still murmuring quietly, but I was alone. At least that's what I told myself. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't focus on anything. I was exhausted, my body felt heavy, and my mind was racing. I decided to do some research on the apartment, desperate to find some explanation for what was happening. I found an old news article about a woman who had lived in the building years ago. Her name was Sarah, and she had disappeared under strange circumstances. According to the article, neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from her apartment in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Scratching, tapping, and even faint whispers. The police never found her, and the case went cold. I didn't know what to do with the information. It didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made things worse. I started to wonder if Sarah's fate would become mine. That night, I barricaded myself in the bedroom. I pushed the dresser in front of the door and made sure the window was locked tight. I left the light on and sat in bed, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline. Hours passed, and I started to think maybe I'd be okay. Maybe whatever was happening would stop. But it didn't. Around 3 a.m., the light started to flicker. I stared at the bulb, my chest tightening. The flickering grew worse until the light went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. My phone's flashlight was my only source of light as I scrambled to turn it on. The beam of light shook in my trembling hand as I scanned the room. That's when I saw it. The shadow. It stood in the corner of the room, tall and still. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, unable to look away. The shadow didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The shadow began to shift, slowly moving closer. The air grew colder with each step it took. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And then, just as it reached the foot of my bed, it stopped. The room fell silent. The shadow leaned forward, and I felt a cold hand brush against my arm. A voice, low and guttural, whispered, "You're mine now." I don't remember what happened after that. I must have passed out because when I woke up, it was morning. The light was back on, and the room was empty. But I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things and left that same day, breaking my lease and moving in with a friend until I could figure out my next step. I never went back to that apartment, and I never looked back. Even now, years later, I still sleep with the lights on, and sometimes in the middle of the night, I wake up with that same feeling, that I'm not alone, that something is watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to fall asleep again. Story the end.
Story number 10.
It was late November when I started having trouble sleeping. I'd always been a sound sleeper, the kind who could knock out as soon as my head hit the pillow, but something about my new apartment made rest elusive. Maybe it was the creaks and groans of the old building, or maybe it was the quiet. It was almost too quiet. After years of living in the city, the absence of car horns and distant chatter felt unnatural. I moved into the apartment 3 weeks earlier. It was a small unit on the second floor of a converted Victorian house, tucked away in a sleepy New England town. The rent was low, which was good because money was tight after a long string of temporary jobs. The landlord, Mr. Carrington, was polite but odd, a wiry man in his 70s who seemed to appear and disappear without a sound. When I signed the lease, he'd handed me the keys with a thin-lipped smile and said, "It's a quiet place. You'll sleep well here." I didn't. The first few nights, I lay awake, listening to the house settle. The floorboards creaked in a way that sounded almost purposeful, like someone pacing just out of sight. I brushed it off, telling myself I wasn't used to the quirks of an old building. But then the dreams started. At first, they weren't so much dreams as fragmented images. A dark hallway, a door slightly ajar, the faint sound of breathing. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, without knowing why. By the end of the first week, I started to dread going to bed. One night, I woke to the sound of scratching. It was faint, but persistent, like fingernails dragging across wood. I sat up, scanning the room. My bedroom window was closed and the curtains were drawn. The scratching wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the walls. I told myself it was mice. Old houses always have mice, right? But deep down, I didn't believe it. The sound wasn't frantic or erratic like you'd expect from an animal. It was deliberate, slow, methodical, as though something or someone was trying to dig its way out. The next morning, I called the landlord. Mr. Carrington listened patiently as I described the noise, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he nodded and said, "I'll look into it." He didn't seem surprised. That night, I went to bed with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. I tried to read to distract myself, but my eyes kept drifting to the walls. I couldn't help imagining something lurking just behind the plaster, waiting for me to fall asleep. I must have drifted off eventually, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sensation of someone standing over me. My room was pitch black, the kind of darkness that makes you question whether your eyes are open or closed. I couldn't move. My arms and legs felt they were encased in cement. Then I heard it. Breathing. Slow, shallow, and so close it felt like it was coming from inside my own chest. I wanted to scream, but my throat wouldn't cooperate. My body was frozen, trapped in that awful liminal state between sleep and wakefulness. I tried to tell myself it was sleep paralysis, a trick of the mind, but the sound of the breathing was too real. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A shadow darker than the surrounding darkness shifted at the foot of my bed. It was tall and angular, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long as it moved. My pulse thundered in my ears as the shadow crept closer, inch by inch, until it loomed over me. I couldn't see its face, or if it even had one, but I felt its gaze, cold and suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest. It leaned in, its head mere inches from mine, and whispered something I couldn't understand. The words were garbled like a tape played backward, but the malice in them was unmistakable. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. I gasped as my body snapped free from its paralysis. I scrambled to turn on the bedside lamp, heart hammering, but the room was empty. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I checked every inch of the apartment, looking for anything to explain what I'd experienced. I found nothing, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Over the next week, the episodes became more frequent. I'd wake up paralyzed, unable to move or speak, with the shadow figure hovering over me. Sometimes I'd hear it whispering. Other times it would simply stand there, watching. I started avoiding sleep altogether, terrified of what I might see if I closed my eyes. The lack of rest took its toll. I began hearing things during the day, soft knocks on the walls, faint whispers in the hallway, the sound of footsteps on the floor above me, even though there was no third floor. I confronted Mr. Carrington again, desperate for answers. When I told him about the shadow figure, his expression darkened. For a moment, I thought he might actually tell me something, but all he said was, "The house is old. It has its quirks." That night, I decided to record myself sleeping. I set up my phone on the nightstand, its camera pointed at the bed. If nothing else, I wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, my stomach dropped. For the first few hours, everything was normal. I tossed and turned, mumbling in my sleep. But then, around 3:14 a.m., the room darkened, as if a shadow had passed over the lens. The figure appeared at the foot of the bed, just as I'd seen it. It didn't walk into view, it simply materialized, its form flickering like a glitch on a screen. It stood there for several minutes, unmoving, before leaning down toward me. At one point, it turned its head toward the camera. My phone screen froze, and the audio distorted into a low, guttural hum. When the footage resumed, the figure was gone. I packed my things that same day and left without looking back. I didn't even wait to break the lease. I just walked out the door and never returned. It's been 6 months since I left that apartment. I moved to a new city, a new apartment, and for a while, things were quiet. But last night, I woke up in the middle of the night, unable to move. The air in the room was heavy, oppressive, and I could feel it. The presence of something watching me from the shadows, and I knew with a sickening certainty that it had followed me. Story the end.